We're back live on CN Live, and we're speaking with Scott Ritter. Scott was integral to the events that were being discussed there in that interview with Katharine Gun and Daniel Ellsberg. He played a major role in what the British, even more than the Americans, said was the main rationale for war, which was that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. And Scott, of course, was a chief weapons inspector for the UNSCOM, United Nations Special Commission, which was established by the ceasefire resolution that ended the first Gulf War. And in a way, the inspectors is a bridge between the first Gulf War and the second, because when that war ended, Saddam surrendered, and amongst the terms was he had to agree to these intrusive inspections throughout the country to look for any weapons of mass destruction that he might have. On top of that, the enormous sanctions that were put on Iraq. I wonder, I'm going to ask Scott if he thinks that that wasn't some kind of humiliation as well as a legitimate reason to go in there to look for weapons. But Scott, thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Can you give me the background now from the can you give me a short history of the weapons inspection regime and what your role was and what weapons were actually found? I just remember I sat in a briefing with Rolf Case, who was your boss at UNSCOM, and I was there when he revealed about the chicken farm, and I'm trying to remember whether there were documents there or actual weapons. But please give us, if you can, a short history and then what your role was.
Certainly. Look, when we went to war against Iraq in 1991, in the aftermath of the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in August of 1990, Iraq had a ballistic missile program, long-range ballistic missiles. Iraq had a chemical weapons program. They had thousands of tons of chemical agent. They used this agent in their war against Iran. They had a biological weapons program. It hadn't produced any weapons, viable weapons, but they had a program, and they had a nuclear weapons program that was about 6 months away from being able to break out and produce a viable nuclear device, not a deliverable weapon, but a device. So Iraq had legitimate WMD programs, real programs. And at the end of the Gulf War, the decision was made by the Security Council through Resolution 687 that these weapons would be destroyed, these programs would be destroyed. Now, a lot of people would think that the primary function of Resolution 687 and the creation of the weapons inspection regime, therefore, was to disarm Iraq. That is not the case. You have to go back to October of 1990 and understand that George Herbert Walker Bush, and justifying the deployment of American troops into the region, likened Saddam Hussein to Adolf Hitler. And he spoke about the absolute necessity of Nuremberg-like retribution, which means that when the war ended, Saddam could not be allowed to stay in power. And the war did end. Saddam was still in power, but Robert Gates, who was the director of the CIA at the time, he had his guys, his analysts, produce an estimate that said, we don't believe that Saddam Hussein can last more than 6 months if we can keep economic sanctions in place. And this is important because sanctions were originally levied against Saddam in August of 1990 when he invaded Kuwait. And the sanctions would be removed once Saddam left Kuwait. That was always the deal. Well, at the end of the war, Saddam was no longer in Kuwait. We removed him. And there was a problem because under the law, you would have to, with the ceasefire resolution, you would have to lift the sanctions. And if you did that, Saddam's economy would recover and we'd have Saddam Hussein in power, which was not the American objective. So the resolution for WMD was a vehicle for the continuation of economic sanctions. Now, instead of being linked to Iraq leaving Kuwait, it was linked to Iraq's compliance with its obligation to disarm. Now, keep in mind, I said a 6-month window. That means the war ended in March. That means that they were looking 6 months down the road by the end of summer for Saddam Hussein to be gone. Weapons inspections were never intended to last more than 6 months. There was never any thought that this was something that was going to drag on for a year, 2 years, 7 years, which means that disarming Iraq was never the objective when they passed this resolution. Now, they didn't tell that to the inspectors. We actually thought that our job was to disarm Iraq, and we actively pursued that. But the Iraqis knew You heard Tariq Aziz say this from day one to Rolf Akeas. Why should we cooperate with you? Because we just heard Madeleine Albright, or actually before Madeleine Albright, we heard George Herbert Walker Bush say, sanctions will never be lifted so long as Saddam Hussein is in power. That was the policy of the Bush administration. That was the policy of the Clinton administration. Even though Security Council resolution said that once a finding that Iraq has been disarmed is made by the Security Council, sanctions will be lifted, the United States said they will never be lifted till Saddam Hussein is removed from power. So the Iraqis were on to this from day one. And that's one of the reasons why they obstructed our work. The other reason is they viewed Iran as a threat, and they felt that they needed to have a residual WMD capability in reserve in case Iran made a move on a weakened Iraq, or an Iraqi army that was destroyed during the Gulf War. Iraq felt that it was basically, very vulnerable to an Iranian attack. So they kept a certain number of missiles, about 98. They kept a couple tons of chemical agent, and they failed to declare their biological program and their nuclear program, not because they were continuing to use weapons, but because they said, if we declare these, the world won't understand, and the inspections will never end. So we'll try and hold on to some missiles, some chemical weapons. We'll get rid of everything else, and we hope that this resolves the issue. Unfortunately for the Iraqis, we didn't believe them. We uncovered their lies, and we continued to investigate and push for them. Unfortunately for the United States, Saddam Hussein proved to be far more resilient than they had thought. And by March of 1992, we had a situation where Saddam was still in power, and the inspections were working, which was the last thing the United States wanted them to do. You see, when inspections work, you start a process of disarmament that can lead to a finding that Iraq is disarmed, and you have to lift sanctions. In March 1992, we forced the Iraqis to admit that they had lied. And suddenly they took us to the burial grounds where they hid the missiles, where they blew up the missiles. They took us to where they got rid of their chemical weapons. We blew up the factories. They gave us a new declaration, and we were well on our way to disarming Iraq. And thus began, a 5-year, 6-year process of trying to, get the final truth so that sanctions could be lifted. But the United States never intended to have sanctions lifted. They always intended to have Saddam Hussein removed from power.
Now, of course, Bush, some people said at the time he should have gone all the way to Baghdad. He thought he can get an uprising in the south with the Shia and the Kurds in the north, and then he left them there to be slaughtered. So they really thought that they could do this in 6 months. That there was that.
Well, again, I was part of Schwarzkopf's staff during that war. There was no way we were going to Baghdad. Yeah, we had a plan. We could have easily punched through the Iraqi forces and gone to Baghdad. But at that time, everybody knew that, one, we would lose the coalition. So, we were based out of Saudi Arabia. We didn't yet have a compliant Kuwait that was going to give us a base there. We were based out of Saudi Arabia, which was very sensitive to American troops being present on their soil. We had Syrians who were our allies. We had a Syrian division. We had an Egyptian division. We had Pakistani brigades, Moroccan brigades. None of these people would have been on our side had we gone on to Baghdad. Indeed, we probably would have lost many of them as allies, which means we'd have hostile forces in our rear. So Bush could never have gone to Baghdad.
Well, how did they expect him to fall in 6 months?
A couple things. When you look at his pillars of power, one of them is his economy. The other one is his status as a leader who provides for his people. And the third one was his weapons of mass destruction that enabled him to defeat Iran and be the only Arab nation to stand up to Israel. His military was defeated on the field of battle by the United States-led coalition. His economy was in tatters because of sanctions. And with UN inspectors on the ground humiliating him, getting him rid of weapons of mass destruction, he no longer, this was the CIA estimate. His 3 pillars were gone. And all we had to do is wait and encourage a Sunni general who looked like Saddam, talked like Saddam, acted like Saddam, but whose last name wasn't Saddam, would provide the 50-cent solution, which is the price of a 9mm bullet they put into the back of Saddam's head. Once Saddam's dead, someone who isn't Saddam is in power, we would be happy. The last thing we wanted was a Shia revolution. The last thing we wanted was a pro-Iranian Shia government. The last thing we wanted was an end to Kurdistan. We wanted a Sunni general to replace Saddam and keep the Baathists in power. That was the goal. That was the objective.
And what they got in the end was a Shia government aligned with Iran after the 2003 invasions. Ultimately, that failed. Elizabeth, I'll bring you in a second, because when, as I said, this was a bridge because the inspections went on all the way up until 2003.
Well,
and
my
that's when
inspections went on until 1998.
yours, okay, but the
Conscom, and then there was a pause, and then in 2002,
well, under Blix and under
it.
about a day, it continued. Right, you are no longer involved then, but you knew enough about what was going on to oppose the war. That's what we really want to get into, because in the spirit of what Ellsberg and Katharine Gun were talking about. Elizabeth, you want to, if that's what you want to get into, Elizabeth, the
Sure.
Scots, well, whatever you got to ask.
Yeah, basically, I was going to just ask you for, your perspective on the interview we just listened to between Katharine Gun and Daniel Ellsberg. Did you? I mean, because you have a very unique insight in those events and the history leading up to those events. So yeah, what was your take on that interview?
Well, first of all, I know Dan Ellsberg very well, and I have nothing but the highest regard for Dan Ellsberg. I'm in awe of what he did with the Pentagon Papers, and I'm in awe of what he's done since then as an activist for peace and for not nuclear nonproliferation. So it's just always a pleasure to watch, and I'm glad he's still alive and well and able to do an interview like that. Katharine Gun, I've never met. I've seen her on the news. I saw the movie, so it was just fascinating to see this historic figure in person and see her speaking. Very soft-spoken, as you would expect from somebody from her former position. I know a lot of people who were SIGINT, analysts, listeners, and they're very introverted people, and so she lived up to that. And she's in a very difficult situation. I don't think she ever imagined that she would be played by Keira Knightley in a feature movie, and that when everybody looks at her now, they're going to see Keira Knightley. But no, I just thought it was a fascinating movie that gave us insight into an event that primarily took place late in the game. I mean, by the time Katharine Gun got involved, the decision to go to war was made. Hers wasn't really an effort to stop the war, because there's no way she could have stopped the war. And I don't think she wanted to stop the war. Not that she didn't want the war to happen, but I don't think that was her objective, was to stop the war. I think her objective was to stop her government from doing something that was dishonorable. And yet her case became one that tested the legitimacy of the war after the fact. And that became a very politically dangerous thing, especially when no weapons of mass destruction were being found. So when you look at the combination of her case, which was going to bring out some uncomfortable truths about the lead up to the war, the lies that were deliberately being told by the British government, no one would care about those lies if they had found weapons of mass destruction. We wouldn't be having this conversation had they found weapons of mass destruction, because the war would forever be seen as legitimate. No matter what the outcome was, the war would have been seen as legitimate. Her case was the first true test of the legitimacy of the war. And that's one of the reasons why I believe the British government punted, because whether they could have convicted her or not, they did not want their attorney general's recommendation to become public, because that would have delegitimized the Blair regime. It would have delegitimized British involvement in the war, and there would have been a blowback to the United States as well. So I think she didn't intend to be in the position she was in, and yet by circumstances of history, she became, a major character in the post-conflict, discussions about the legit. Because remember, at the time that her case is being heard, you have the Butler Commission taking place that's looking into this. The British actually did a heck of a lot better job in investigating the shortcomings of their case for war than the United States did. In parallel with the Butler Commission, you had the Senate Select Intelligence Committee doing an absolute whitewash. You had other commissions whitewashing. You had the CIA whitewashing. America's very good at whitewashing. The British actually, I think truth, the definition of truth and honor means something in England. It doesn't mean it's perfectly applied, but I think there was a lot of embarrassment on the part of the British government to have been caught out, and they were caught out earlier than they wanted to be by Katharine Gun's legal case.
And speaking of that divide between the UK and the US, I mean, one of the unfortunate things about her story is that it is so little known in the United States. And we talked about that during the interview with her, but I also wanted to ask you about that, about the potentially intentional role the media played in basically, suppressing that story. And we know that there was the confusion with the typo that was eventually corrected. But in addition to that, do you think that it was an intentional move by major outlets of the U.S. media to essentially suppress that story?
Oh, absolutely. I'll give you, it doesn't deal with Katharine, but I'll just give you some insight. In September 2002, I traveled to Baghdad to speak to the Iraqi parliament in an effort to get the Iraqi government to allow weapons inspectors to come back in. And in this, I was very successful. It's one of the highlights of my life. When I came back after everybody called me a traitor and accused me of treason and, the worst foul things you could imagine being said about you, to have the Iraqi government say, yeah, we heard you and we're going to let weapons inspectors back in. I thought I had actually stopped the war. I was ecstatic. When I went on that trip, I had called up CNN and asked them if they wanted to accompany me. And I'd give them sort of the insight because I was trying to build up media coverage for this. And CNN, played a little bait and switch where they pretended that they wanted to help me. But then when I got there, they said, no, we don't want to have anything to do with you. And then while I was there, they were just stabbing me in the back. And I was actually scheduled to go on Crossfire. And the night that I was there, it was Robert Novak and Paul Begala. And they were getting ready to crucify me together, tag team, death to Ritter. And yet 5 minutes before we went on airtime, the Iraqi government announced that they were letting weapons inspectors back in. So now they had to eat crow. It was a great moment. And then CNN asked me to stay. This was, they asked me to stay in Atlanta. And I was invited to their headquarters. And they brought me into an auditorium where they had 60 CNN producers, the talking heads, everybody. And I was subjected to a grilling. Basically, the head of CNN was there and he said, go. And they asked me questions. I had documents and everything to back it up. And when I finished, I'd answered all their questions, and they said, my God, he's a credible person. We can use him. And he basically gave me the seal of approval and said, you can come on CNN now because we've approved you. He told the producers, start booking him. And then he took me to show me their facilities. This is in early October now of 2002. They had a war room already built, already mapped, already staffed. They were already coordinating with the Pentagon about embedding journalists. It was all there. They were ready to go to war, and they wanted to bring me on to be a war cheerleader, to be somebody saying, to explain the war and all this stuff. And I'm like, guys, don't you understand that I just tried to stop this war, that weapons inspectors have to be given a chance? And they were like, no, that's not the story we want to tell. I said, I don't care what story you want to tell. Let me tell you what the story is. The story is peace. The story is stopping a war. The story that this is stupid, this is suicidal. But their story was Congress voting to authorize military force, that weapons inspectors would never be allowed to do their job. And that's what they wanted. They wanted me to explain about how Iraq concealed things and how Iraq hid things. And I wanted to explain about how inspectors can actually do the job in the most difficult situations. That's not the story they wanted. But I brought that up because I'll give you another example. In November, the New York Times sent Barry Barak, Pulitzer Prize winning guy, and they were going to do a profile on me as the great peacemaker. And I said, okay. And so Barry Barak followed me for a week while I traveled up and spoke at colleges, including Harvard and MIT, et cetera. He wrote the worst hit piece you'll ever read about somebody, and that was their job. That was the New York Times job. I was getting too credible. People were starting to believe me. And so the New York Times wrote a hit piece that basically said, the Ritter's all over the place. You can't trust Ritter. He's unreliable. You can read it yourself. It was published in the New York Times Magazine. That was the attitude of the American media. They did not want to talk about the possibility of there being no weapons of mass destruction. They wanted to talk about the threat that Saddam Hussein posed to international peace and security, and anything that interrupted that narrative was an inconvenient story. So when you have a Katharine Gun starting, coming out and saying, whoa, the entire basis for this is a lie, that's not a story the American media wanted to tell. They had committed too many resources into the war, and they had committed a lot of their reputation to the war. The New York Times had Judith Miller that they had to deal with. CNN had its own problems. The leather jackets they were giving to Uday to get access to I mean, there's not a media outlet in the United States, with maybe the exception of, I think it was McClatchy might have been doing some good stuff. But other than that, none of them shone. They were all had made a business decision that war is good for business, and therefore they're going to support this war. And anybody who was getting in the way by putting out an alternative message would be run over by the media machine.
That's really fascinating insights into CNN in particular. I guess it takes a while to get those graphics and that music up there for Desert Storm. That doesn't happen overnight, does it? They had this all planned out. When did you turn against this idea? Well, maybe you probably never were for this invasion, but after you left the inspections, and when you started seeing this march towards war, and that the WMD became the most important reason being given, what did you think? And when did were you from the beginning opposed to this idea of there being WMD there at all, or that the war would have been illegal or a mistake anyway?
Look, as I tried to explain to the Senate, I wasn't an activist. I was a professional. I was a professional intelligence officer. I was a professional inspector. And as an intelligence officer, my job is to tell the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth. I don't give a damn if you don't like what I'm telling you. I'm going to tell you what the truth is. And as an inspector, my job is to operate within the four corners of the mandate that I've been given, which is Security Council Resolution 687. From the very beginning, as my time as inspector, and I was there from the beginning in 1991 up until 1998 and the end of UNSCOM. So I was there the whole time. I'm one of the only inspectors that was there the entire time. And from the very beginning, I was in a constant clash with the United States over the truth. The United States wanted to be in control of the inspection process, and you do that by controlling the intelligence, because we inspect based upon intelligence. The Iraqi declaration is a lie. We can no longer use this. So now, to hunt the hidden weaponry, we need intelligence. I said we have to develop our own intelligence capability so that it's pure process. The CIA didn't want that. They wanted to be dictating to us where we could go so they could dictate the pace of inspections and they could anticipate the operation. That's a long way of saying that from the very beginning there was friction between the inspectors and the United States government because of this battle for the legitimacy of inspections. In 1993, I led the ballistic missile aspect of the inspections early on. In 1993, I was called to give a briefing to the director of CIA, Jim Woolsey. And I briefed him on the fact that we had accounted for all of Iraq's Scud missiles. There were no more missiles left. There were two that we didn't know exactly what happened, but we had bits and pieces that we dug out of the ground. So we know they're not real missiles anymore, but I can't tell you exactly what happened to these, but everything else was gone. And we could confirm it. We had the numbers on our side. This was not the message that the director of the CIA wanted to hear. And within a week of my briefing him, the CIA put out an estimate that said, no, there's 200 missiles unaccounted for. They just made up a number. And that was sort of the fight that I had. Now, as an inspector, I could do a couple things. I could quit, but that's not gonna accomplish my mission. My mission, therefore, became to prove the CIA wrong. And we carried out inspections after inspections, digging. Now, we also had another problem is, even if we had the numbers on our side, we had the fact that the Iraqis were lying to us and that they had, in fact, hidden weapons from us at a certain time. So in order for me to accept the number that I was getting today, I had to go back and prove that the mechanism Iraq was using to conceal weapons no longer existed, and that the Iraqis admitted they had this mechanism, and we went through that to prove that there was no longer any hidden weapons. Well, that mechanism was the Iraqi presidential security, and the Iraqis were loath to let us anywhere near that. So we had a constant confrontation with the Iraqis over us trying to legitimately do our work, the Iraqis fearing that if they cooperated with us, that information would be used by the CIA to assassinate Saddam, which it was going to be used by the CIA to assassinate Saddam. So this is the kind of struggle that took place. This is a long way of saying that by 1998, I knew that we had disarmed Iraq from 95 to 98%. There was nothing left. I knew that we had monitoring systems in place covering the totality of Iraq's industrial infrastructure. We knew they weren't producing any new weapons. And yet we couldn't give them a clean bill of health because we had 3 to 5% unaccounted for, and the United States said we have to know where everything is. And so I was pushing very aggressively to discover what had happened to that final stuff, because that's what we needed to get over the finish line, to finish our job. The United States did not want me to cross the finish line. And this was a big struggle. This is where Bill Clinton said in April of 1998 that he was going to support inspectors with everything the United States had, and yet they stopped all of my inspections. They prevented me from going into Iraq. They picked on me personally, and until I had no choice but to resign. When I resigned, I spoke out against U.S. policy. A lot of people say, well, why didn't you say there's no WMD? It wasn't my job. My job was to say I'm not being allowed to do my job. As a weapons inspector, I have to be allowed to finish the investigation so that we can make the conclusion. And I maintained that. I spoke about the need for integrity of the inspections. Even when I testified before the Senate, I said we have to be allowed to complete our mission. A lot of people twisted that to say Scott Ritter saying that Iraq is armed to the gills with weapons of mass destruction. That was the last thing I was saying. I said the exact opposite. I just said that there's stuff that's unaccounted for, and according to the law, as long as Iraq doesn't have 100% compliance, it still constitutes a threat to international peace and security. That's what the law says. That's what my mandate says, and I operate off of my mandate. In December of 1998, when the United States ordered weapons inspectors out of Iraq using an inspection as a pretext for war, that's when I felt liberated to say the inspection process is corrupt. It's no longer viable. We can't expect inspectors to go back in. And that's when I said, look, we've disarmed them. There's nothing left. You just killed the inspection process, but you can't now say that Iraq represents a threat worthy of war because they have WMD, because we know they don't have WMD. And I altered my message. I wrote an article for Arms Control Today that got a lot of coverage in the Senate and the House about the difference between the qualitative and quantitative disarmament. I said, we have been doing quantitative disarmament, trying to account for every nut, bolt, and screw. And that's allowed people to abuse the message and say, we haven't accounted for everything, therefore they're a threat. I said, but if we speak of qualitative disarmament and look at what we've actually done, we've gotten rid of all the weapons, we've gotten rid of the programs, they can't produce anything in a factory, so there are no weapons anymore. And that was the message that I was trying to pound, going in. They made it difficult. Before I resigned, I don't think a lot of people know this, but I was summoned to the U.S. mission on the day that I resigned, and the CA chief of station there put me in contact with a senior State Department official who begged me to stay. They said, if you resign this program, you're going to destroy UNSCOM. You can't resign. You have to stay. The CIA offered to give me a medal. They were just throwing stuff at me to have me stay. I said, I can't. I got to resign and do the right. And the CIA guy told me the most honest thing they've ever told me the entire time I worked for them. If you resign, the FBI is going to, the word begins with an F, bang you in the butt. That's a polite way of saying it. I said, David, you got to do what you got to do. The day I resigned, they leaked to CBS, Dan Rather, lead story, Scott Ritter is an Israeli spy. And they charged me with espionage. And I spent 4 years and $140,000. It bankrupted me, getting the Southern District of New York to drop that case. But they were never going to charge me because they knew that I had done nothing wrong. But what they did is they start the process of destroying you as a witness. And that was the earliest thing that happened. They said I was an Israeli spy. I had to get legal counsel. Nobody would hire me at that point. All the job opportunities that are supposed to come to people who have great expertise. No, I didn't get a single job opportunity because they said, you're an Israeli spy. We can't hire you. It was a very difficult time. My family has never recovered from that, from what happened that day. That's what they do to you. That's what they do to you. And that happened to me right from the start, and it continued throughout. So, trying to tell the truth is a very difficult thing in the United States of America.
So if in 98, they didn't want you to leave because they wanted you to continue these inspections ad infinitum, and you couldn't do that.
Well, they wouldn't let me do my job.
Yeah.
They wouldn't let me do my job with integrity. Yeah.
But by that point, you said that they were 95% free of WMD, correct?
Yeah. And
that's
we
98. That's 5 years before the invasion.
Correct.
But I remember in December now, 2002, I believe it was December, Iraq made this presentation. Mm-hmm. It came into UN headquarters in New York. I don't know, thousands of CD-ROMs and documents. They laid it all out. Do you remember that?
Well, the reason why I remember it is I helped them prepare that.
You helped them prepare.
No, not in 2002. The document they prepared was our work. It was the record of our work as UNSCOM inspectors. It was
presented as the dossier. It was supposed to be Iraq's dossier, weapons.
It was their dossier, but if you go to the ballistic missile dossier, I wrote it. I mean, if you go to the parts of the chemical, I wrote it. You do know
about it then, yeah.
I wrote it. I mean, because the Iraqis were working with us to document their disarmament so the Security Council could lift the sanctions.
Well, who's us at that point in 2002?
UNSCOM. No. I'm telling you, the dossier was written in 1998.
Are you kidding me? The one that they delivered 5 years later?
It had slight updates about what had transpired from there, but the bulk of that the dossier was delivered to UNSCOM between 1996 and 1998.
Because I remember they wouldn't let the other Security Council members have it. They even tried to prevent, I think, permanent members.
Well, one of the reasons, there's a couple reasons. One is that that dossier tells you how to produce sarin nerve agent, VX nerve agent. It tells you how to produce a nuclear bomb. It tells you how to produce anthrax. It lays everything out. So you don't want that information going out, or else you're proliferating.
Right.
That's.
So by 2002, you knew that there was no rationale for an invasion of Iraq based on WMD. Absolutely, right? And then you started to speak out against it.
In 1998. I knew that in 1992.
But now you saw the war coming. You saw that there was actually going to be an invasion based on this lie.
Well,
all people knew that this was a lie, right?
Is I already fought a war with them. Okay, I was part of the buildup in 1990. I know how to fight a war. I was on General Al Gray's staff. I was part of a special 5-person cell advising and doing war planning for General Gray before the war, and then I was on Schwarzkopf's staff during the war. There's a thing called the tip fiddle. That's a long term, but it just basically means you're moving forces into region. And we knew the tip fiddle started being activated in August, and it was in August 1990. We knew by October that there was going to be a war, because once you get a certain momentum going, you can't stop the process. It's too expensive. And by October, it committed too many forces. We were going to war no matter what. In 1990, the war was inevitable. It was never going to be stopped. So with that experience, I'm watching the buildup in 2002, and I recognize that if we don't stop this, if we don't do something by September, October, the war is inevitable. That's why I took the suicidal move of going to Baghdad to speak to the parliament. That was a desperate attempt to get the Iraqis to do something that could pause the tip fiddle. They didn't. Congress voted for a war, and by November, I knew, and I told everybody, there will be a war. There's no way to stop it. It doesn't matter what the Iraqis do now, there will be a war.
But the inspectors did go back in, and it's widely believed falsely that Saddam kicked them out. They were actually asked to leave then, weren't they?
So, well, the inspectors in 1998 were ordered to leave by the Clinton administration. In 2002, 2003, the inspectors were on the ground doing their job and actually making great progress. Yeah. And they kept saying, just give us a little bit more time and we can come to closure. The United States said, no, leave, we're bombing tomorrow.
Yeah.
And so the inspectors literally left, and the next day the bombs started falling.
You went on Donahue. Wasn't that one of the more important appearances that you had?
Well, that was right before the war. I did a number of appearances, but Donahue was very supportive. And I actually had a interesting debate with my former boss, Richard Butler, about
Oh yeah,
about the legitimate. I also confronted Ahmed Chalabi. I confronted some senators. Told Inhafi to do his job. But no. The irony was at that point in time, facts simply didn't matter.
Right.
What mattered is it's the same process that we see today when we talk about Iran or we talk about Syria. Don't even try to talk about facts with Syria because you'll be labeled pro-Putin, pro-Assad. Don't try to talk about facts about Iran. You'll be labeled pro-Mullah. You're sympathetic to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. No, I'm not. I'm sympathetic to the truth. I'm actually sympathetic to the young Marine who's going to die on the beach in Iran because you're telling lies about a war. That's where my true sympathies lie. Look, if Iran deserves to fight us, I'll unleash the Marines, let them kill them all. That's what we do. We kill people better than anybody. But that's not, just because we have a force that's capable of killing doesn't mean it's legitimate to unleash this force. And especially we have an obligation as American citizens and as people who aren't going to war to exhaust every possibility short of war before we turn these forces loose. And that was a frustrating thing, is that I actually believed in 2002 that I could make a difference because I was uniquely armed with the truth. I actually had the hubris to believe that if I went out there and said things, if I wrote things, if I tried, if I sacrificed my family, because I sacrificed my family. My wife was saying, don't do this, don't do this. They're going to kill you. They're going to destroy you. They're going to ruin you. And if they ruin you, they ruin the family. And I said, honey, no. The truth is a weapon. The truth is a weapon. If I can just tell the truth to the right people, if they'll just listen, something can happen. And I committed fully, 100%. Bankrupted my family. I had paying legal fees. I destroyed my reputation because, God damn, if you speak the truth, excuse my language, but if you dare speak the truth, you become an enemy of the state. You don't become somebody that people want. You're a troublemaker. You're a whistleblower. You're this, you're that. But I did it anyway because I honestly believed I could stop a war. And it's one of the great failures of my life, and it led to a Great Depression. I mean, it's just not an easy thing to believe that that nobody cared about the truth. And it's today I'm a little bit more jaundiced. I've grown to accept the fact that unfortunately Americans don't care about the truth, and so I still try to tell it, but my level of expectation is not very high.
It's interesting you say, even if you just talk about facts, you're smeared as being pro-Saddam, pro-Putin,
Absolutely.
pro-Assad. And that's basically, just to say about Consortium News and Bob Perry when he was alive, he was attacked for all that. And he was just putting out facts. That's all he was doing. And that made him
the truth is the enemy.
pro-Saddam. Now, when you have something in common with Katharine Gun, because you both tried in your own ways, deeply involved in this issue to try to stop this war. Do you remember when you read the Observer story? You probably weren't surprised that the U.S. was asking the GCHQ to spy on the missions, right?
I gotta be careful what I say, but not only I knew it was happening.
Yeah,
we knew from day one, from 1991. We were told, be careful what you say in the UN building because your people are going to be reading it in the transcript. We were told by the U.S. government, be careful what you say because I don't want to have to be sitting in the White House Situation Room explaining why Scott Ritter is saying something. So shut up in the UN building. There was a secure room that the British had that they swept. We could go into a secure room in the UN, speak freely, and we were told that. Or there were places that
I knew that room. That room was behind the Trusteeship Council. Right?
Yeah, and it's swept by the British security.
My office was back down there. Now it explains why you didn't talk to me that time I stopped you in the lobby of the UN buildings.
Well, honestly. I didn't talk to anybody.
You wouldn't talk to me. Now they're listening to me as well now.
I was not allowed to talk to anybody, and I didn't. I was very good at that.
Well, Scott, we've got a story, together with Katharine's, of two people who did their damnness to stop that war and failed, but you don't regret having tried now, despite what you said about your family.
No, actually, my wife and I had this conversation just the other day because we're still digging out of this mess. It's once financial ruin is financial ruin, and there's a reason why they call it ruin. and you know, we're digging, and we were talking. Fact is, we were talking because of this movie. The director sent me a link, and I was able to watch the movie online, and we talked about the movie and stuff, and the question was asked, would I do it all over again? And my wife said, I hope the answer is no. And I said, no, unfortunately, the answer is yes, because that's who you married, and you knew it when you married me. And she said, you're right, but you know, I would hope that you would have learned from your mistakes. And she doesn't say it's a mistake to tell the truth. She just says that, you know, tilting at windmills isn't necessarily you know, a wise decision when there are innocents who pay the price. And the families pay a horrible, horrible price. And that's something that, you know, everybody who wants to tell the truth needs to understand, that, you know, if you've got people who rely on you for support, or, you know, for anything, you're betraying them. It's a betrayal. It's an act of betrayal, because, you know, I swore to you know, to take care of my wife. I swore to take care of my kids. And then I went and thought I was doing the right thing. And by doing the right thing, I actually did the worst thing to my family. They've forgiven me. They love me to death. My daughters still are very proud, and my wife is very proud. But, you know, our life would have been very different had I not done this. And it would have been different in a way that would have been physically much better for us. But I have to tell you that I can wake up in the morning and look in the mirror and be damn proud of the face that stares back. It's a little uglier. It's got a lot more gray, but I'm proud of of what I've done. And my wife is proud of it too. It's just that it's hard to, you know, it's hard to say you're proud and then go work 2 or 3 jobs to pay the bills. And you know, pride only takes you so far. Memories only take you so far. The reality is, at the end of the day, there's a mortgage to be paid. There's utilities to be paid. There's college bills to be paid, and it's tough to pay it when nobody wants to hire you. So
now, one of the most obvious parallels between your experience and that of Katharine Gun is the focus on basically strong-arming the UN, sabotaging the UN and its role. Do you think that type of sabotage is necessary when we go into the present and future attempts to kind of push war on the American public and the, you know, UK public and the Australian public, or do you think that was something that was kind of unique to the time in the late 90s and early 2000s? Do you think that they're even going to bother with that anymore?
Well, I mean, it's interesting what you said. First of all, I don't think that nations really want to stand up to the United States no matter what. So I don't think you need to go to all this. I mean, as they proved, it didn't matter. We went to war without a UN vote anyways, and we got away with it. The world cannot stop the United States. It's just a simple fact. We like to go through the niceties. We like to pretend that we're the good guy. We like to cover ourselves with perfume when we smell like something else. And the other thing is also there's you know, American exceptionalism brings with it a hell of a lot of hubris. And I'm convinced that we simply can't do the right thing. We have to strong arm people to do it our way or the highway. And it goes on to this day. I mean, we saw that in you know, with the way they treated the Brazilian head of the OPCW when he tried to, you know, come into Iraq at the war. They destroyed his reputation. We've seen it anytime anybody stands up to the United States, they get destroyed, they get attacked, because the United States can't handle criticism, cannot handle criticism. But the sad thing is that we don't need to be this way because of how big we are and how powerful we are. We're going to get our way anyway. And it actually, we'd succeed a lot more if we just were nice about it and polite about it and said, well, I'm sorry, I understand you disagree with me, but I've got this 500,000 man army and I'm moving it over here and we're just going to do it. And we apologize. But we can't do that. We have to get you to believe, you have to say that what we're doing is the most wonderful thing in the world since sliced bread. And it's still happening today. We still spy on the UN. We spy on everybody. I mean, after 9/11, look at the size of the intelligence community. It's expanded beyond imagination. What do these people all do? And you know, it's stunning. They have so many analysts. What are they analyzing? And why aren't they doing a better job? I mean, this massive intelligence community, they haven't gotten anything right. They have yet to produce an intelligence estimate that's right because they can't, because the truth is the enemy. A good estimate is built on the truth, and the truth is the enemy. So now we have a politicized intelligence, and that's what we're seeing today, with what the CIA is doing. They can't even tell the truth about American elections because that's an inconvenient truth. You have to demonize somebody. You have to have an enemy. You have to have a bad guy. And so the CIA is in the business of, telling lies. And I hate to say that because there's probably some good people in the CIA, but the fact of the matter is you have a junior analyst who will tell you off the record, they will never let that kind of report past middle management. It gets stopped at middle management. For what reason? Politics.
Very well said, and incredible insight. I think that it does seem as if the niceties are kind of going by the wayside as we move forward. I mean, we don't really see that intense focus on manipulating the UN, at least from my perspective, that we did prior to the Iraq War. So what do you think about also the state of whistleblowing in general? I asked this of Katharine Gun, but I'd also like to hear your thoughts on it, because we see Ellsberg, we see Gun, they are not imprisoned right now. They are, free to go about their lives. We have Chelsea Manning imprisoned, Daniel Hale being prosecuted, Assange is a publisher also imprisoned. Where do you think that's headed? Is it only going to get worse, or is there going to be some sort of turning point eventually?
It's only going to get worse. There's not going to be a turning point. The American people don't have the courage to have a turning point. In order for a turning point, politicians have to be afraid that they're going to be voted out of office by a disgruntled electorate. The American people are good. Look, this is a tough one for me because I'm not your traditional whistleblower. I have yet to release classified American information. I will never release classified American information. I signed a non-disclosure agreement, and I will go to the grave with my non-disclosure agreement. That's the point of honor with me. Everything I've talked about as a UN weapons inspector was UN information. It wasn't American classified information. And so I have trouble with people who tell American secrets. I mean, I understand why they do it. I understand the motivations. I see people like Daniel Ellsberg who, by doing so, made a historical positive impact. I'm not condemning them. I'm just saying, from my perspective, I could never do it because I'm too much of a Marine. I'm still that guy that salutes smartly and obeys the orders. Fortunately for me, the Marine Corps never asked me to lie. The Marine Corps only asked me to do the right thing. It's the CIA, who I never worked for, who asked me to lie. It's the NSA, who I never worked for, who asked me to lie. But the Marine Corps never asked me to lie, nor would they, because that's not what Marines do. So I have trouble. Whistleblowers bother me. But then I take a look at what's going on today with this so-called whistleblower and the politicization of the whistleblowing process. And that bothers me too, because here's something where you're supposed to go through the wickets and do the right thing, but I just believe it's being used for the wrong purposes. I think it's being used for politics. You don't use the intelligence community to go after a president, no matter what. That seems to be what's happening. So, I understand the need for whistleblowing. I understand the need for whistleblowing, and I respect those people who have the courage to do it. I just couldn't be one of those people. I don't have the courage to do what they did in that form, to actually break the law of my country. I'm not going to break the law of my country when it comes to national secrets. But I respect those who have said that's what I need to do to make, because I was sort of in an easy position. I got to speak out freely because I had 8 years of UN experience that wasn't covered by a non-disclosure agreement. So I could speak as freely as I want and piss the hell out of my country without breaking any laws. They tried to charge me with espionage, but at the end of the day, it was determined that I was a UN employee, and therefore I didn't have a security clearance per se, even though the US government treated me as if I had a top secret clearance. When they handed stuff over to UNSCOM, it was in effect declassified. So I was protected in that way. Had I had to break the law to tell the story, I don't think I would have. I don't think I would have crossed that bridge. And that makes me lesser of a person than a Chelsea Manning, lesser of a person than a Snowden or an Ellsberg. These are people who actually, believed so strongly in what they're doing that they were willing to break the law.
And you, there was a story at the time that the CIA had infiltrated UNSCOM. I think the Washington Post wrote that story.
Right.
Was that true?
Well, infiltration is a tough word. We invited them in. So you can't infiltrate when the invitation's there. Look, when I came in, in 1991, I was tasked with setting up an intelligence unit. And if you open up the UN phone book, you will not find an intelligent unit.
Well, I know. And governments don't want to share with the UN very much, do they?
Well, they don't, but they needed to and they had to. So we put out a proffer, and nations responded, and the United States responded, and the CIA was one of many agencies that provided personnel and information and operational and technological support. We invited them in. Our prerequisite for this was that they work for the mandate of disarmament. And what they want to tell their government afterwards, what they want to go back and report afterwards, is their business. We prefer that they kept it confidential, but we're realistic. But while you have the blue passport and you're in Iraq, you're doing UNSCOM business and only UNSCOM business.
Right. And as an international civil servant, as a UN employee and international civil servant, you're not allowed to take instructions from your government.
You're not allowed to take instructions at all. That's right. When you work,
they try to give you instructions.
Oh well, they tried early on, and I told them the pound sand, and Rolf Achaeus backed me up, and that was it. They never tried again. But they're a little bit more subtle than that too. You control an operation not by ordering me to do it, but recognizing that I need information to do my job. So if you can control the source of the information, you control me doing my job. What they didn't want is me going out and developing my own sources of information, developing relationships outside of the CIA. For instance, in 1994, from the very beginning, the U.S. provided a U-2 aircraft, high-altitude surveillance aircraft that would take photographs in Iraq, and they were supposed to turn these photographs over to us. But what they did is they provided these briefing teams that came in and gave us degraded photographs, and it was crap. I mean, we'd have these briefings where guys would come in and say, here's a facility, there's a suspected crane here, there's a suspicious building here, and I said, dude, I just got back from this facility last week. The crane's there because there was a heavy rain that collapsed the side of the building, so they're rebuilding the building. The suspicious building, here's a temporary structure put in to store the equipment. Why are you putting out garbage? Why don't you just ask us? We wrote a report about this. But they wouldn't do that. We got frustrated with this, and we requested the ability to go down to Washington, D.C. Naval Yard and work with the photo interpreters going through the imagery and helping them do it so we get a better product. They wouldn't allow that to happen. So then I got Rolf Achaeus to say, well, it's our film. It's our aircraft, even though you fly because of us. Turn the film over to us, and I'm going to Israel. Because the Israelis were ready to support us, but they needed a vehicle. So I went to Israel and set up a vehicle where we would use the imagery to look at Iraq, and then the Israelis I would ask questions, and the Israelis would turn over all the intelligence that I needed to do this. Now, you would say, why would you go to Israel if it's Iraq? Who's going to slide the envelope under the door with the top secret information that says Iraq is cheating and lying if we dared say Iraq is disarmed without getting Israel to check off on it? By going to Israel, I co-opted Israel. I trapped Israel. And by the end of this, believe it or not, Israel supported our finding that Iraq had been fundamentally disarmed. Why? Because we investigated every lead Israel gave us, and there was nothing left. Israel had to say, yeah, we agree with you. We're not happy about this, but we agree with you. The U.S. couldn't handle that. But no, I went to Israel. The interesting thing is I would submit requests to the CIA requesting the film. The CIA would deliver the film to me. I'd sign a receipt. I take it. I deliver the film to the chief of station in the Tel Aviv embassy and have it released to me for my work and then return it to him. And I was charged with espionage. This is the basis of the espionage charge by the United States, that I was turning over classified information to the Israeli government. It's crazy. But the point, I had this relationship with the British. I had a very close relationship with MI6. I had a very close relationship with the Defense Intelligence Service. I had a very close relationship with German intelligence, with Dutch intelligence, Jordanian intelligence. I had a close relationship with every intelligence service in the world that had anything to do with Iraq. Why? Because I needed this information so I could do my job. I didn't want to become a prisoner of the CIA. Ironically, in 1997, I tried to go to Iran and establish a relationship with the Iranians. Why? Because they have a vested interest in Iraq being disarmed. And so if the Iranians had any intelligence that Iraq was hiding weapons, I wanted to know it so I could investigate it. The U.S. said, absolutely not. You're an American citizen. If you step one foot in Iran, we'll have you arrested. And, that's how they controlled me on that. But no, on the intelligence side of the house, my job was to empower the inspection process with the best quality intelligence information the world had. And I would gather that, and then I would improve on it, because I would take their intelligence information, go into Iraq, and I would find out what the truth is, what intelligence information is good, which one's bad. And I would come back with more knowledge than the intelligence services actually had. So I was controlling the operations. And that's what made me a threat to the CIA, is that I was more knowledgeable about Iraq than they were. My information was relevant, my information was actionable, and they had to stop this. And they did. They stopped it by putting pressure on Richard Butler. They stopped it by putting pressure on governments. They got the Israelis to stop cooperating. They got the British to stop cooperating. They got everybody to stop cooperating. So by the summer of 1998, I was heading up a super secret investigation unit that no longer had information that we could investigate. I had no choice but to resign, because I was no longer allowed to do my job. They wanted me basically rubber stamp findings that Iraq was in non-compliance. They didn't want me to search for the truth. My job as an inspector was to search for the truth. So I had to resign. I think your microphone.
That was the Clinton administration in 1998.
Yes.
Right? Were they thinking of some kind of action against Iraq at that time?
Well,
beyond the pinprick strikes, the no-fly zone, beyond the no-fly zone.
Absolutely. Look, in 1996, Bill Clinton, we talk about CIA infiltration. In 1996, we did a very big inspection of what I call the shake the tree inspection, to test whether or not we knew that in 1991, 1992, Saddam Hussein's personal security forces were responsible for hiding weapons of mass destruction. The Iraqis denied this. So I had to test whether or not they were still involved in hiding. So we did a huge campaign where we would deliberately, I don't want to use the word attack, because we didn't attack, we inspected, but we would go to the units of Saddam Hussein's presidential security, and we blanketed it with SIGINT, with imagery, with inspectors, with spies on the ground, and to see if anything moved, see if they were moving weapons of mass destruction from us. It was a very big inspection that was getting to the heart of Saddam's security. The CIA played a very important role in this. They have a unit called the Special Activities Staff. That's their covert operators, their paramilitary people, and they provided significant communication support, etc. Well, it turned out that the CIA piggybacked their attempt to launch a coup against Saddam Hussein with our inspection. So as our inspection went in, there was one facility that I was not allowed to inspect. I was told by the U.S., you can't go to this Special Republican Guard facility. And the reason is, that was the one who was going to launch the coup. They wanted me to go to all the other ones, lock them down, get them tied up, and then at the appropriate moment, this unit was going to rise up and kill Saddam Hussein and take over. Unfortunately for the CIA and unfortunately for UNSCOM, the Iraqis broke this case long before, and they knew exactly what was going on. And that's the point. I had an Iraqi brigadier general who, we had a relationship built on trust. And he pulled me aside and he said, "Did you know anything about this?" I said, "No, I'm an inspector." He said, "Well, understand, we can never trust you again. That we'll never view you as an inspector again. We will always view you as the man who brought the CIA in to kill Saddam Hussein." And that happened in 1996. When that coup failed, Bill Clinton turned to the CIA and said, "You got to get rid of Saddam. We need to, we need to start putting in place a plan to do that." And so the Clinton administration had always been about regime change, 100% about regime change. In 1998, they signed the Iraq Liberation Act. I mean, that's about regime change. So the Clinton administration never had any intention of allowing us to disarm Iraq. They always wanted to get rid of Saddam Hussein because he had caused Bill Clinton personal embarrassment. And you don't embarrass a president and survive.
So let's talk about the CIA whistleblower. You referred to him. You alluded to him earlier. Do you have any thoughts about this at all? Who this person might be, what their motives might have been?
Well, first of all, let's start off by saying I don't know anything. I mean, that's, and nobody knows anything. I mean, they've kept his identity secret. New York Times released a little bit of information about that alludes that he's a CIA analyst, that he has a Ukrainian specialty. They also talk about his political loyalty, his proclivities, not loyalties, but the fact that he's sort of a pro-Biden kind of guy. That's okay. I knew a lot of CIA people that were, that were just rabid progressive Democrats. I also knew some rabid conservatives, and I knew a lot of people in between. You can be a good intelligence officer and have your own personal political beliefs. That's fine and dandy. I don't believe that you can work in a National Security Council and have your own personal political beliefs. I don't believe, because the National Security Council is not an intelligence organization. It is a policy organization. It's implementing the policies of a partisan government, whether it be a Republican government or a Democratic government. So if you're going to be assigned to the National Security Council, you need to be politically aligned with the policies you're going to be asked to implement. So I find it very suspicious if this guy was indeed a Biden guy, that he would be sent to a Trump White House. That's a giant red flag. That's always been the case. You don't send somebody in who can't align themselves, because you're not just an intelligence person. You're now you're facilitating the implementation of policy that is political by its very nature. You're carrying out the policies of a Republican administration. And if your sympathies are Democratic, you have an inherent conflict of interest. You can go sit back at CIA headquarters and do an analysis of facts. Intelligence is not policy. But when you sit in the National Security Council, so I'm a little bit suspicious of that. I'm also suspicious of the fact that his lawyer has come out and admitted that they started collaborating before the whistleblower report was submitted, which means that this was not as cause-effect as people might think. It seems to be a little bit more deliberate than that, that this was a deliberate action, which opens the door for people to say that maybe this guy was setting Trump up from the start. That's a line of thinking that can't be dismissed by the facts. You have a political partisan who, by the admission of his own lawyer, has carried out a premeditated act. And the guy's not an innocent. He knew exactly what he was doing. He collected the appropriate information. He cataloged it. He organized it, and he's produced a damning indictment of Trump. The other problem
is it a damning indictment?
Say again?
Is it a damning indictment? I mean,
well, on the surface,
what Trump was engaged in, if he was engaged in this, is pretty much routine way foreign policy is carried out, right?
Look,
and
every president
you
has.
could have got anybody on this. So
yeah, if you release every telephone conversation of every president in the last 20 years, you will find that they all did the same thing. They may not have talked about Joe Biden's son, but look, it's politics. I think Trump. Trump doesn't do anything with finesse, so I think he was a little bit more in your face than maybe another politician was. My big concern here, though, isn't necessarily that this was in isolation. As you know, I wrote an article for you guys that talks about a Russian defector that was managed by Brennan, the former director of Central Intelligence. And my concern is that that this was a double agent, and that Brennan knew it was a double agent at the time that he allowed the intelligence community to act on it. And that's a criminal act. My concern is that Bill Barr, or the Attorney General Barr, and his the gentleman from Connecticut who's investigating, is coming close to the truth. Barr has said, "I want to know about this source. I want to know about what happened." And the Inspector General's report may be published anytime soon. Barr's report may be published anytime soon. And I think that Brennan realized that the game was up. I think the whole leaking of this Russian defector's identity and stuff was done on purpose to deflect and to create a narrative that would be different from the one that Barr might be putting in. And I think Barr realizes that if this report comes out, he's sunk. And it's not just Barr that's sunk. The Obama administration sunk. Biden's sunk. Everybody's sunk. It's the Democrats are sunk, because it will have exposed this entire Russiagate thing as not just a lie, but a fabrication. And my concern is that what we're seeing here today is a distraction from that this is Brennan Part 2. I'd like to know if this analyst, this whistleblower, worked for Brennan. I'd like to know if he was part of the special fusion cell that Brennan set up. He's got the political resume. Obviously they know where his political leanings are. I'd like to know why he chose not to whistleblow on Brennan, because if this is a senior analyst in the Europe and Eurasia field, which covers Russia and Ukraine, he would have known what Brennan did. Why didn't he choose to whistleblow on that? Why did he have to infiltrate himself in? And remember, you don't get assigned to the National Security Council. You volunteer. You volunteer because it's a political assignment. People like to go there because it's sort of a high-profile gig. You get to rub shoulders with the president and such. But it's not as though he was dragged kicking and screaming. This guy opted to be in the Trump National Security Council. And if he was politically opposed to Trump, you have to ask yourself, what was the motives? I just think there's a lot more to this story that than what's being presented on the media. And
Scott,
I'm skeptical.
That's pretty interesting what you're telling us. And I want to thank you now for joining us. I do want to point out, though, that I think Trump was politically motivated, and I'm not letting him off the hook, but Biden should be investigated for giving his son a job on a board a few weeks after he helped engineer a coup d'etat. But anyway, that's something else. Scott, thanks so much. Really, it was great. Incredible insights. I really appreciate you being with us, and hope to have you back soon.
Okay, thank you.
Forever on this. I learned a lot.